Something feels off right now, and a lot of Canadians are starting to sense it, even if they can't quite put their finger on why. The world suddenly feels less predictable, less polite, less stable, and the uncomfortable truth is, Canada is no longer safely insulated from that chaos. Not anymore. Here's where things get interesting. This shift isn't happening because Canada changed. It's happening because the environment around Canada did. And a big part of that change is Donald Trump re-entering the center of American power and influence, bringing with him a worldview that treats pressure as a tool, allies as leverage, and stability as something that has to earn its place every single day. This isn't panic, it's not hyperbole. It's the conclusion a growing number of defense analysts, economists, and security experts are quietly reaching. When Trump shapes U.S. policy, the rules don't disappear overnight, but they do soften. They become negotiable. Agreements stop being foundations and start being bargaining chips. And when that happens, Canada doesn't get to sit comfortably on the sidelines. It gets pulled directly into the blast radius. Let's start with something most people overlook. Canada's security has never been just about Canada. For decades, it's been intertwined with assumptions about American restraint, predictability, and shared values.
You know, so many people, of course, are looking ahead to the midterm elections, but there are going to be so many political landmines for this administration to have to deal with even before we get to November. And perhaps I think the biggest is going to be what will take place with those negotiations over Kuzma, because we know already the president has signaled that he could and perhaps likely will walk away from this massive trade deal. And that's going to have enormous economic implications, not only for the United States, but for Canada as well. And certainly, given the cooling economy right now, the jobs outlook in terms of rising inflation and unemployment, those and what the president does on that trade agreement will certainly have a tremendous impact on all of that. And what the president does will have tremendous meaning for the global outlook as well.
The conversation surrounding this deal, Eric, has become so important here in Canada, of course, but do we have any signals on what it is that could potentially make Trump walk away from this?
Well, it's his own words, and what we've heard specifically and directly from his U.S. trade representative back in November when public meetings began in earnest here in the United States. And of course, the administration was hearing from a number of key individuals and organizations as it relates to Kuzma. What we kept hearing over and over, even as industry and academics and others were singing the praises of this regional free trade agreement, it was the administration itself that continued to say that they believe Canada was giving the United States a raw deal, and the president could very well walk away. Now, all of this could be about negotiating tactics. We know Donald Trump.
The idea was simple. If the United States remains stable and committed to cooperative systems, Canada remains safe by extension. That assumption worked for a long time. But assumptions are fragile things, especially when leadership styles change. Trump's approach to power is transactional at its core. He doesn't see alliances as relationships to maintain. He sees them as deals to renegotiate. If something doesn't produce immediate advantage, he questions its value. We saw this clearly during his previous term, when long-standing trade agreements were openly threatened and economic disruption was used as a negotiating tactic rather than a last resort. That memory matters right now because it's happening again, and this time the stakes are higher.
We know Donald Trump is very good at trying to set the stage for that. But nevertheless, given how the president has talked about Canada and more importantly, how he's acted, again, this is very much, I think, a very real concern.
All right, so from negotiating tactics now to military action, Eric, and when we look at what's happened recently, you know, the tankers in Venezuela, the presence in Greenland, I mean, these are big military moves. What could they signal for next year?
Yeah, and I think this is something that Canada also should be deeply worried about. Just recently, we have seen missile strikes in Nigeria. The president has named an envoy to actually negotiate Greenland becoming part of the United States. And when Donald Trump came into office, he made clear that he would be willing to use what he called economic force to actually take Canada as well. And so when you look at the military aggression in Venezuela, Canada has an enormous amount of vast natural resources. And that is what the play is for Donald Trump and his ambitions to bring Canada under U.S. sovereignty has not waned at all this year. In fact, when you look at the moves that we're seeing in places like Greenland, Venezuela, Nigeria, I think that only puts a bigger target.
The conversation around CUSMA, the trade agreement binding Canada, the US, and Mexico, has once again become tense and uncertain. Trump has repeatedly suggested the deal disadvantages the United States. His own trade officials have echoed that sentiment publicly, and while some analysts believe this is classic negotiating pressure, others warn that the damage doesn't require him to actually walk away. The threat alone is enough to rattle markets, freeze investment, and inject instability into an already cooling economy. Here's why that matters more than people think. Canada's economy is deeply intertwined with U.S. trade flows. Jobs, supply chains, and regional industries all depend on predictability. When Trump signals he's willing to tear up agreements on principle, that predictability evaporates. Inflation fears rise, investment slows, and unemployment becomes a real concern. This isn't abstract theory. It's exactly what happened last time. But now, here's the twist. The concern no longer stops at economics. Over the past year, Trump's rhetoric and actions have signaled a renewed comfort with military assertiveness on the global stage. From missile strikes abroad to aggressive posturing in strategically sensitive regions, the pattern is familiar. When Washington projects power forcefully, the consequences rarely remain confined to the immediate theater of action.
Is going to play massively in his belief and his thinking and his ambitions that Canada should be part of the United States.
Which is notable, Eric, that that's still very much on the radar because in Canada, of course, the reaction to the entire 51st state suggestion conversation has been everything from, laughing it off as a joke to that very serious message of Canada is not for sale. But this is still very much in Trump's sights.
Absolutely, it is. And it hasn't gone away, which is surprising because oftentimes when Donald Trump says things like this, wanting Greenland, oftentimes we see it as bluster, that this is the president being just a master showman. But when you look at actions, Canada is still the only G7 nation that does not have a free trade agreement with the United States, save for CUSMA. The president continues to see tariffs as a really good thing, even though they're debilitating both for the U.S. and Canadian economy. And more importantly, we're talking about more than a century of friendship, alliance, and partnership. And Donald Trump has already attempted in every way imaginable to blow that up. And the reason, of course, is the president believes that he can weaken Canada and in doing so, make it that much easier for the United States to overtake the nation.
Well, before we let you go, Eric, on that note, how are tariffs going for President Trump around the rest of the world? Because we knew that at one time this was very much not just a Canada conversation.
That's right. The president, it's been basically the U.S. versus the world as the United States has placed massive tariffs on all nations across the globe. And that is going to be, again, another sticky issue for the president in 2026 as the Supreme Court is expected to rule once again on tariffs. And this has been Donald Trump's signature economic policy. And the Supreme Court's decision will be crucial because it will ultimately determine where the power to implement tariffs lies, either with the executive branch squarely in Donald Trump's hands or with Congress. And that will certainly shape CUSMA, relations with Canada, and more importantly, what happens with those tariffs.
Strategic rivals don't isolate risk that neatly. They look at alignment, proximity, and vulnerability. And this is where Canada enters the picture in a way that should genuinely give people pause. Canada is not just America's closest ally. It is its closest neighbor, physically and strategically. Shared airspace, shared waterways, shared infrastructure. When the United States becomes more confrontational under an assertive philosophy, Canada becomes more exposed whether it wants to or not. It doesn't need to provoke anything. It doesn't need to choose a side. Its geography already did that for it. From the reactions I've seen among security experts, this is the part that has changed the tone of the conversation. Canada is no longer being discussed as a passive beneficiary of American power, but as an adjacent risk surface. If tensions rise globally, Canada isn't invisible. It's adjacent. It's connected. And in a destabilized environment, that matters. This is why defense, sovereignty, and military readiness have suddenly surged to the top of Prime Minister Mark Carney's agenda. Not because he's trying to sound tough, not because Canada wants confrontation, but because ignoring risk at this moment starts to look less like restraint and more like negligence. There's also a deeply unsettling political layer that many Canadians are only now beginning to take seriously. For years, Trump's comments about Canada were brushed off as bluster. The jokes about annexation, the casual references to Canada as the 51st state, the rhetoric suggesting economic or political dominance. It was easier to laugh it off than confront what it implied. But language reveals mindset, and Trump's language toward Canada has consistently reflected dominance rather than partnership, ownership rather than equality. When he talks about using economic force, or when he frames trade relationships as something the U.S. tolerates rather than values, it signals a worldview where weakening a partner increases leverage. In my view, this isn't about literal annexation plans. It's about power psychology. Trump sees advantage in dependence. He sees influence in imbalance. Undermined sovereignty and leverage follows. That's why security analysts are urging Canadians to stop dismissing the rhetoric entirely. Not because it will happen tomorrow, but because it shapes how policy decisions are made. This is where the tension really comes from. Canada's national identity has long been built on diplomacy, cooperation, and moral credibility. Those strengths are real, and they still matter. But a world increasingly shaped by coercion doesn't reward values alone. It rewards capability. Carney seems to understand this. His push toward defense modernization isn't about abandoning Canada's character. It's about protecting it. A sovereign country shouldn't rely entirely on the goodwill or restraint of external leaders to remain secure. It should have the capacity to defend itself independently if circumstances demand it. That distinction is critical. Peace as a value is not the same thing as peace as a guarantee. Values don't stop pressure. Capability does. This realization is driving one of the most significant shifts in Canadian defense thinking in decades, particularly when it comes to the Arctic. For a long time, the Arctic was treated as distant, remote, and largely symbolic. Climate change has shattered that illusion. Melting ice is opening routes, exposing resources, and attracting global interest. Russia sees opportunity there. So do other major powers. Here's the part most people misunderstand. If Canada cannot credibly operate and sustain presence in its own Arctic, someone else will shape outcomes there by default. Sovereignty isn't declared, it's exercised. And exercising it across vast, hostile terrain requires more than good intentions. That's why the discussion around amphibious capability has become so important. Canada has one of the longest coastlines in the world, yet it lacks a modern amphibious landing platform. That means limited ability to rapidly deploy forces, transport heavy equipment, or sustain operations in remote regions, especially in emergencies. An amphibious ship changes that equation entirely. It acts as a mobile base. It doesn't require established ports. It can deliver personnel, vehicles, and supplies directly where they're needed. It supports disaster response, Arctic sovereignty patrols, humanitarian missions, and alliance commitments. Most major navies already have this capability. Australia has invested heavily in it. China has expanded it. The United States has relied on it for decades. For Canada, this isn't about preparing for invasion. It's about eliminating vulnerability. In international politics, weakness invites pressure. Capability discourages it. The Royal Canadian Navy has openly acknowledged this gap. Military planners have described scenarios where northern communities face emergencies in winter conditions, and current assets struggle to sustain long-term response. An ice-capable amphibious ship would fundamentally alter that reality. It would allow Canada to operate where improvisation currently substitutes for planning. What's telling is that early discussions with Canadian shipyards about building such vessels have reportedly been promising. This isn't fantasy. It's a serious, practical proposal being evaluated within a broader defense investment framework that includes tens of billions in funding over the coming years. When you connect all of these dots, the picture becomes clearer. Trump's return to influence, his pressure-first worldview, renewed economic threats, increased global military assertiveness, Canada's proximity and alignment, and Carney's accelerated push for defense modernization. This isn't reactionary, it's strategic. Canada isn't preparing because it wants conflict. It's preparing because it refuses to operate under illusion. A responsible government doesn't hope instability disappears. It assumes it might deepen and plans accordingly. Trump thrives in environments where others hesitate. Carney's approach suggests Canada will no longer confuse hesitation with virtue. Strength isn't provocation, it's protection, it's discipline, it's maturity. Canada has never defined itself by aggression. It has defined itself by restraint, cooperation, and reason. None of that changes here. What changes is the recognition that those values must be defended, not simply assumed. In a world where unpredictability is becoming normal again, readiness isn't a boast, it's dignity. And right now, it may be one of the most important choices Canada can make. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.